So we're going to solve another problem using matrices. So I already took your system and converted it to a matrix. Remember, you just take the coefficients, and when it says equals, you draw that vertical line, and then anything it equals is on the right side. So our goal matrix is, so what we did is, remember, when you want a 1, you multiply that row by a fraction. So if it said like 2 there and I wanted a 1, I would do 1/2 times row whatever. If I want a 0, that means I'm going to multiply a different row and then add it to the row where I want that 0. So we work with column 1 first. So the first number we want is a 1 here and a 1 here. Remember, the easiest way to do this is if I look and I see a different one in one of my different rows, I can just switch it. So I notice in row 2 there's a 1, so I'm going to switch rows 1 and 2. This is my notation to show I'm switching it. And then I'm just going to rewrite it. So this is 1, -1, 2, or 1, -1, 2, and then 9. And now row 2 is 2, 1, 2, 18. Row 3 I did not do anything to, so it stays the same. So I got that done now. Second step is to get a 0 here. So if I look, I have a 2 here. So when I want a 0, I need to multiply a row and add it to the row I want a 0 in. So here, I know I want a 0 in row 2. So I'm adding something to row 2. If I think about it, 2 plus what would give me 0? Well, that would be -2. So what I use is row 1, and I'm going to do -2, row 1. That way, if I do -2 times 1, I get -2. So when I add it to 2, I'm going to get 0. Remember, you're only changing row 2 though. So rows 1 and 3 are going to stay the same. So I'm going to rewrite this before I do my math, just so I know, hey, I'm only changing row 2 here. Okay, so it says -2 row 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do -2 times row 1. When I do that, I would get -2, 2, -4, then -18. Then it says add it to row 2. So I'm just going to rewrite row 2 here in purple. And then I'm going to add it. So this is kind of my show your work step. So you don't need to do this if you're willing to, or you don't need to write this in the matrix. It's kind of off to the side. It's all your work before your final matrix. So -2 plus 2 is 0, which I wanted, so I did it correctly. 2 plus 1 is 3. -4 plus 2 is -2. And then -18 plus 18 is 0. And that's okay if I get 0 there. That's perfectly fine. My next step is I want a 0 in that row 3. So if I look, I have a 1 there, which is not a 0. So remember, when I want a 0, I need to multiply a row and add it to another row. So let's take a look. Well, I can't multiply it by row 2 because anything times 0 is going to give me 0. So my only choice is row 1 here. So 1, since I want this to be a 0, 1 plus what would give me 0? Well, that would be -1. So I'm going to multiply row 1 by -1 and add it to row 3. So I need to add it to row 3 because this is the one I want to change. If I add it to row 3, that means rows 1 and 2 stay the same. So I'm just going to rewrite rows 1 and 2. So -1, row 1, is going to be in green. So I take this row and I multiply it by -1. So I would get -1, 1, -2, -9. Then I'm going to add it to row 3. So I'm going to rewrite row 3 here. So when I add it, I would get -1 plus 1 is 0, which I wanted. Remember, that was my goal, just to change that number, which I did. 1 plus 2 is 3. -2 plus -1 is -3. And then I would get -3 as well here. So this changes to 3, -3, -3. Which is great because I got my column 1 done. So remember, once column 1 is done, right? This part right here, I got 1, 0, 0. I stop using row 1. So now my choices start to lessen. So I can only use rows 2 and 3. So I'm just going to move my matrix down so I can work. Okay, taking a look here. My next goal is to get a 1 here, a 1 here. So when I want a 1, now I multiply the row. Usually you just take whatever there and put 1 above it. So here, if I want 3 to turn into 1, I just put 3 on the bottom and 1 on the top. That is it. Row 2. Meaning rows 1 and 3 are going to stay the same now. So I would get 0. 3 times 1/3 is 1, which I wanted, so I did it correctly. -2 times 1/3 is -2 over 3. And then 0 times 1/3 is still 0. Again, it is okay if you have a fraction. Life goes on. Next part is this next blue dot. I want a 0. So where this 3 is, I need a 0. Remember, if you want a 0, you multiply the row and add it to the other row. Since I want a 0 in row 3, I need to do plus row 3. Now I can't use row 1, so my only option is row 2. But I have to think, 3 times what is, or 3 plus what is going to give me 0? Well, 3 plus -3 would give me 0. So I multiply row 2 by -3. When I multiply row 2 by -3, so this green part here, I would get 0, -3. Well, -3 times -2 over 3 is just 2. And then I would get 0. So then what I do is I add that to row 3. So I'm going to rewrite row 3 here. And then I'm going to add it. So my new row 3 is going to be 0, 0, which I wanted. So good job to me. 2 plus -1, which is -1. And then 0 plus -3, which is -3. So then I rewrite that matrix. Only changing row 3 though. So rows 1 and 2 stay the same. Row 3 changes to 0, 0, -1, -3. We're almost done. If I look at my goal matrix, I only have one more spot to do. It is this one here. It says it wants a 1. Well, it's -1. Remember, when you want 1, you multiply the row. Since this is 1, -1 times what would give me 1? Well, that would just be -1. So we're going to do -1 row 3. So I would get, remember, first 2 rows stay the same because I didn't change them. And then row 3 would become 0, 0, 1, 3. So I check, I see everything on this diagonal is 1, everything below it is 0. So I did it correctly. Finally, I can state everything. So starting with the bottom row. Remember, this is your X column, this is your Y column, this is your Z column. So if you want to at this point, you could write all your little X and Y and Z's. So if I'm looking at row 3, well, 0x is 0, 0y is 0. So really it's saying 1z is equal to 3. Therefore, z is just 3. Okay, let's go up to row 2 now. Row 2 is saying 0x, which doesn't really matter. And then 1y minus 2 over 3z equals 0. Well, you just solved for z. It was 3. So this would be y minus 2 over 3 times 3 equals 0. So I would get y minus 2 equals 0. Therefore, y equals 2. Last one is this top one. I'm going to drop it down here. So I get 1x minus 1y plus 2z equals 9. Well, you already know what y and z are, so let's plug that in. So we get x minus 1 times 2 plus 2 times 3 equals 9. So I would get x minus 2 plus 6 equals 9. Combine like terms, we would get x plus 4 equals 9. Therefore, x equals 5. So my final solution is 5, 2, 3. So, like I said, these are mostly patterns. As long as you know what your goal matrix is, so up here, and how to get a 1 and a 0, you can do it. So I want you to at least attempt the homework, or come in, watch this, and try this one on your own tonight. So you already have the correct answer. Try it or try the homework. And then Tuesday, we are going to practice more on it. I expect you to know what to do, though, when you want a 1 and you want a 0. Have a good night.